Estonia and Catalan under Francoism and Estonia under Soviet communism. So you'll see parallels here, that you can replace the word communist with fascist, and the word Estonian with Catalan, you'll get basically the same situation in a lot of ways. In any case, so under the Soviet regime, every public situation acquired some sort of symbolic meaning, and this is important in the use of language, that all language was monitored to some extent. So the media was used for creating an alternative reality, an ideologically correct symbolic environment filled with content designed to socialize the audience to the ideas and values of communism. So not to give information, which normally the media is what they do, but it was to indoctrinate people. Estonian did continue to be used parallel to Russian, as has already been mentioned, but there was significant prestige given to Russian. Even if it wasn't, as Uldis mentioned, an official language of the Soviet Union, it was given the prestige and it functioned as the official language. And here's a quote from a Latvian poet, an ethnic Latvian, talking about the prestige of the Russian language. So even though it is true, and I'm not debating this, that the vast majority of people remained loyal to the language and didn't change their first language to Russian, in publications, prestige had to be given to the language, and so that's an example of it. A lot of myths were created regarding past friendships between Estonians and Russians and other Slavs. Again, the same happened elsewhere. And there were specific catchphrases used to promote the Russian language. So Russian is the language of international communication. Again, even if it wasn't the official Soviet language, it was the language of international communication. It means the same thing. International meaning between the nations of the Soviet Union, not between the Soviet Union and other countries. Russian as a second national language, and it's not in that set of examples, but it was even later called a second mother tongue. So voluntarily adopted, obviously that's slightly ironic. Common lexical fund, again, Russian being the source of when you needed new words. Mutual enrichment of languages, well, no, it was the Common Lexical Fund. So even though in theory the Russian was supposed to be enriched by the other languages, that wasn't the case. And convergence and fusion of peoples, but leading to the greater strength of Russian. Other things that happened besides the prestige given to the Russian language, there was cleaning out of libraries and bookshops, getting rid of essentially most things printed in Estonian. It wasn't like in Catalonia where the aim was to get rid of everything written in that language. Here the problem was political, that you had to get rid of things that were bourgeois, that did not agree with the Soviet ideology of communism. But it amounted to, as you can see there by the percentage, most publications in any case. Streets were renamed, some cities as well. All the newspapers all took on new communist-sounding names, so that the main newspaper became the voice of the people. The one from Tartu became Forward. All this communist ideology. And words in their official public use, at least, took on new meanings. So words that might have been neutral or negative before suddenly became positive under communism. So dictatorship, which normally sounds like a negative word, well, in the communist sense, it became positive. Revolution, communism, socialism. Party, normally a neutral word, became something positive. Nationalist, nation, capitalist, bourgeois, all negative. Direct borrowing from Russian, not a great deal of it, but when there were things that didn't exist in the independent Estonian, the language in independent Estonia, that new words were needed. So these were quite often just directly borrowed. The Russification of language became particularly strong at the end of the 1970s when a set of recommendations were sent to the different republics. And this was really the first time, even though it wasn't officially published, this set of recommendations, but obviously became public because it was found out, the aim was through the education system to make everybody eventually monolingually Russian, which of course didn't happen. But, and in addition to that, the directive was to increase the use of Russian in the media, social, in society in general, cultural groups, education. And as I said, even though it wasn't an official language, because the state authorities had to be approved by Moscow, so in the cities where there were large numbers of Russian people living, the default language of administration was always Russian. And especially in the northeast, which you'll see when I show you a map of the breakdown of where the minorities are in Estonia, that the northeast is heavily, or almost, at least in the city of Narva, almost completely Russian-speaking. It's 95%. In southern Estonia, even during the Soviet period, you could still live without Russian, because the proportion of Russians there was very small, as long as you didn't go to Tallinn, for example. So things didn't happen only, the Estonian wasn't repressed only because of the things that happened to the language itself, but also to the ways the language could be used. So writers were seen as suspicious, so they often left or were made to leave. There's a quote there from an Estonian author. Cultural organizations were closed, and then they had to reopen as branches of the all-union version. So the local culture wasn't able to be independent. Any cultural publications had to include political material, and only standard politicized forms of expression were allowed. So anything that seemed, that didn't follow the communist ideology wouldn't be allowed. And it resulted in dull, vague, militaristic sound of language. And it's something that you'll notice even in Estonia now, that there's particular terms that are used in the Estonian language which sound very militaristic. And it's a direct result of the way that language was used in the Soviet Union. And of the main university, Tartu University, less than a quarter of the faculty remained. Censorship, and this is an area where I say that you can swap over the Soviet for Francoist and you'll get essentially the same list of things that you couldn't talk about in the media. Again, this isn't a direct assault on the language, but it affected the way that the language could be used, and everything was monitored. Of course, at more local levels, the censorship was less strict, but everything was still monitored. As Uldis mentioned, there was, of course, resistance, and the language obviously maintained itself and survived. So people became very creative about what and where to write, how to publish it. But an example of the general resistance can be seen from the results of the census. In 1970, only 29% of Estonians said that they could speak Russian, and it's just not possible, because as I mentioned before, the default language of administration and so on in the country was Russian. So obviously the figure must have been much higher. In 1979, if you just recall, I just mentioned that in the late 70s the Russification of language was intensified. The number decreases to 24%. Again, it's not possible. So it's a form of cultural resistance that people essentially lied when they gave their answer to the census. In later years, censorship was loosened, and essentially what we can talk about is a private national world. As Uldis mentioned, people knew the Latvian national anthem. How is it possible? Because of these two very separate sociolinguistic spheres. One was the one at home, where people continued to speak the language, versus the public ideology, which was Russianized. Not to say that Russian-speaking people necessarily believed in it either. I think they certainly did so more so. But when we separate the linguistic worlds, the Russian part of it belongs to that public sphere for the Estonians and for the Latvians. One of the main things that caused the problems that the situation that we were facing at the renewal of independence was the large numbers of immigrants or settlers, whatever you want to call them, that came in to staff the factories. As Uldis mentioned, it wasn't so much a case in Lithuania because they had more farmers which could be used, or maybe they fought it off themselves, as you said. But what we can see there is from 1934, 88.2%. I think, Uldis, your years were slightly different, so we've got different numbers. But if you take the year just before the Second World War, it's almost 100% of the country is Estonian speaking because the Germans left, and so did the Swedes. We had a Swedish speaking minority as well. So from that down to 61.6% at the end of the Soviet Union. So here you can see a comparison of the three countries. Lithuania essentially stayed the same, whereas the Slavic proportion goes up in all three countries. Here I've got comparing two different years with the people, the non-native population speaking the local language. I go into more detail of the more nuances with the changes that have happened in Estonia later. But as you can see, even in those 11 years there's been substantial increases. In Estonia, even maybe the change is even larger. It's hard to say. It's about this.
You start from a smaller base.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. Yeah, that the base in Estonia was very small, just over 10%. Of course, one thing that's important to point out is that because Estonian is not an Indo-European language, it is harder to learn if your native language is Russian or well, in this case Russian, because that's who we're talking about. So, what I've called the situation, and well, obviously I didn't invent the term diglossia, but I believe that the situation at the end of the Soviet period is quite a good example of diglossia, where we have the two different languages. One is the one for use in public spheres and for international communication and in official levels, and the other one is essentially a family home language. Obviously, it wasn't fully diglossic, especially, as I mentioned already, in the southern parts of the country, because in those areas they were and still are majority Estonian and Estonian speaking. But if you lived in Tallinn, for example, that definitely was the case. And now, of course, because I'm sure you're thinking, oh, but it can't still be that way. Of course it's not. Now, of course, the situation is more or less reversed, but it's not black and white. And that's what I'll talk more about later. But I think it's important to mention this because even if we do say that now that Estonian is somehow, not suppressing, but, is in this power relationship over Russian in the country, well, we have to think that, well, Russian exists elsewhere, but Estonian doesn't. So this issue of the need to maintain the language, which I'm sure you understand because that's why we're here.